Hey, hello everybody. So today we are going to hopefully finish up with the reproductive system. So today we'll do a quick recap on what we covered on Wednesday and move into the female reproductive system. It's possible we won't quite get to fertilization, so we may have like 5 or 10 more minutes to cover on Monday, but really all of next week we're going to be focusing on reviewing for first exam 4 and then for our final. Okay, so let's get going with a reminder of where we were last time we talked. Okay, so one of the things that we want to remember from last time, so we had talked about how exactly we end up with either a male or female reproductive system in the first place. So one of the things we covered was this general sort of embryonic development of either male or female reproductive parts. Okay, so we had these two structures, the Wolffian duct and the Mullerian duct, which lead either to our female development or to our male development. All right. So we talked about the fact that embryonically, all embryos have both of these. In the absence of a Y chromosome, we go down the female route. So in the absence of a Y chromosome, the Wolffian duct degenerates, the Mullerian duct stays there and in fact increases a little bit, forming the female reproductive system. But in the case that we do have a Y chromosome, has this gene on it, the SRY gene, that codes for something called testis determining factor, which creates the formation of testes, which then secrete testosterone, as well as something called Mullerian inhibiting hormone. Okay? And the effect of Mullerian inhibiting hormone is to cause the Mullerian duct to regress, and the testosterone helps the Wolffian duct grow, and the Wolffian duct ultimately becomes the male reproductive system. Okay. So we had also talked about the development of sperm. So we saw that throughout the course of life, males are able to continually produce sperm, and there's a progression from early spermatogonia in the sort of basal section of the lining of the tubes in the testes. So protected by Sertoli cells, we have these spermatogonia. They undergo meiosis as they move towards the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. They eventually become spermatozoa. We're going to contrast this as we talk today about the development of ova, of egg cells, which is going to be quite different than this. So we're going to see a lot of hormonal mediation of the female cycle, and we're going to see that there are several kind of stop points in meiosis when we look at females, whereas in males, this is a relatively smooth process that just keeps going and going. Okay. So we had left off with a brief note on the sexual response in males. So I just want to remind you, because I know we had like one slide left, that mainly what we were thinking about was the difference between parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation here. So we start with the erection caused by parasympathetics, and we lead to emission and ejaculation that are under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. And all of this is receiving signals from mechanoreceptors in the penis and the erogenous zones, as well as some input from higher brain centers. So we looked at emission. Now we have this shift from parasympathetic to sympathetic control. So this is the point at which we have the sympathetic nervous system starting to take over. Okay. So in response to continued mechanical stimulation, where we're having the sympathetic control take over, leading to contractions of the epididymis, vas deferens, and ejaculatory duct via peristalsis, right? We have progressive contractions kind of moving sperm down the tube. We have secretions mixing in, leading to the volume of semen. So the sperm is coming from the testes, but the fluid is coming from the seminal vesicles and the prostate. We have the movement of sperm into the urethra, leading to eventually ejaculation as mechanical stimulation continues. So this is fully mediated by sympathetic activity, so no parasympathetics involved, but we have continued contractions of smooth muscle, basically. And at the ending of this, we make sure that we close the urethral sphincter. The urethral sphincter closes, and at some point, we close it off so that we have semen moving through the urethra, but not urine. It's important. And so we have the semen move through the urethra and out of the body instead of urine moving through the urethra. Okay. So that brings us to the reproductive system part 2, which is going to focus on the female reproductive system. All right, so when we're thinking about the female reproductive system, we want to think about the fact that we have a monthly cycle that is developing through different hormone levels, the regulation of hormone concentrations, kind of playing off each other, causing the development of different characteristics in the ovaries and the egg cells, as well as in the uterus. And these hormones change on a monthly basis, but they also change over the lifespan. So changes to these hormones are also ultimately going to cause the menstrual cycle to cease eventually in the female lifespan. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about ova and their development, so the egg cells. We're going to be thinking about the menstrual cycle. So really there we're kind of thinking about the uterus. And we're thinking about long-term hormonal regulation as well as we start to think about menopause, which is when the menstrual cycle ceases. Okay. So the female reproductive system is characterized by these cycles. So we have these cyclic changes in activity, both in terms of like what's going on in these physical structures in the ova, in the follicles, in the lining of the uterus, but also cycles in hormones. And the observable thing that we see, right, is the menstrual cycle. The female reproductive system is also different than the male in that there are restricted periods of fertility. So under your stereotypical conditions, right, women aren't fertile all the time. They are restricted to fertility during this period around ovulation. So slightly before ovulation, slightly after ovulation, while we have a mature ovum ready to be fertilized. Another thing that's different about the female reproductive system compared to the male reproductive system is that there are a limited number of gametes. So there are a limited number of these cells that can be used for sexual reproduction. The total pool is established at birth. So we're going to go through those early phases of meiosis, actually early in fetal development and at birth. And so we're not going to have this continued production of gametes the way we had continued production of sperm in males. So the system works differently in females. And that's hopefully not a surprise to any of you, but we're going to talk about it today. Okay. So we've seen the basic organs in lab, so you can see some of those on the right. So what we're going to be focusing on today is we're going to be focusing really inside the ovary. So we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about these structures called follicles. So you can see follicles here, follicles here. We're going to be thinking about how they develop in response to hormones and how that ultimately leads to ovulations. Okay. So what a follicle really is a follicle is an oocyte. So an oocyte is our future egg cell, our actual egg cell, just not fully developed yet. surrounded by a kind of epithelial layer. So that's what we see in brown or beige surrounding it. Okay, so that's ultimately a follicle. A primordial follicle is pretty undeveloped. So that's the one we have this zoomed in picture of, right? This is our primordial follicle. But we can see that we are going to make this follicle get bigger and bigger as we progress. Okay. So we're going to see that these follicles develop, and they develop some new structures as we lead towards ovulation. Okay. Usually we're going to talk about these kind of two separate layers of cells, the oocyte versus these follicle cells on the outside. We're often going to be talking about the oocyte versus the granulosa cells. So the granulosa cells are referring to kind of cells in this outer layer. And we talk about granulosa cells more in the kind of middle sections of development, right? So we don't usually talk about them using that term in primordial follicles, but they're what that layer is turning into. So while the granulosa cells are not the ones that carry the genetic information for sexual reproduction, they are important because they're the target of hormones. So they're kind of analogous to the Sertoli cells in males, where we had the androgens coming in and the Sertoli cells were kind of supporting development. In the case of the female reproductive system, that's the job of the granulosa cells. So the granulosa cells are going to have receptors for estrogen and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and they're going to secrete other chemical messengers in response to these signals. One of those chemical messengers they're going to secrete is inhibin. So we saw that in males as well. So in the granulosa cells, when they secrete inhibin, this is going to be a negative feedback loop, which turns off the FSH secretion. And we'll take a look at the kind of map of hormone secretion a couple times. So we'll see the role of inhibin. But the granulosa cells overall, their job is really to support development of the oocytes. So they're going to be transporting nutrients to the growing oocyte. They're also going to secrete estrogens and progesterone in these kind of early phases of development of the oocyte. Okay. This is just a comparison of the Sertoli cells and the granulosa cells in case you're curious about how they kind of pair up. You can see that there are a fair number of similarities between the two, and there are also plenty of differences. But let's look back at the follicles and let's look at the development of that internal cell, that one in the middle, the oocyte. Okay, so ultimately, just like we went from spermatogonia to actual mature sperm eventually, in females we're going from oogonia to mature ova, which is the plural of ovum. Sorry for the Latin, everybody. Okay, but that's what's going on here. So we have this pathway. So just like in males, we have to go through meiosis to get there, to get to our mature cell ready for sexual reproduction. But unlike in males, we have really long pauses between the kind of cycles of development here. So I want you to actually notice here, right, that this whole big beige box, this is talking about what's happening in fetal development. And then this one is saying that we're talking about what's going on prior to ovulation. And then we actually have our third phase, so the second half of meiosis, only actually happening after fertilization. So this process of going from oogonia to an actually fully mature ovum, takes decades potentially. Okay, so that's really different than what we saw in males. So in fetal life, the oogonia produce our primary oocytes. And this is where we have our first pause, which we refer to as meiotic arrest. Okay. So this is why there's a limited pool of ultimately egg cells in females. It's because this first step where we get our primary oocytes happens before birth, right? So we don't have these oogonia constantly reproducing themselves in a cycle and developing more and more. We start out with these primary oocytes already ready to enter meiosis during the menstrual cycle, as we begin ovulation and then going into fertilization. Okay. Well, yeah, I think I hammered those home. Okay, so we're going to move forward and talk about the changes in the ovary and the changes in the uterus before we actually talk about how eventually the oocyte that's released, the secondary oocyte, moves out of the ovary into the fallopian tubes and potentially gets fertilized and therefore completes meiosis too. So we're going to spend some time talking about the actual release of those cells and the cycles that are going on in the uterus at the same time before we talk about fertilization and the kind of final steps of this meiotic process. Okay, so when we're thinking about the menstrual cycle, we should really be thinking about two separate kind of cycles. They're related to each other and you can map them onto each other, but they're two different processes. So one thing we can focus on is what's going on in the ovarian cycle. So we're going to have one set of progressions and changes in the ovaries themselves related to these oocytes and follicles. We're going to have a different series of changes going on in the uterus. So we can focus on the menstrual cycle on either of these organs, depending on what we're interested in. When we look at the ovarian cycle, we're going to see that we need to break it down into two subphases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase, which are going to have big implications for what kind of relationships we see between different hormones. We'll see that the uterine cycle does have phases as well, but the phases of the uterine cycle are more about changes to the physical structure of the uterus rather than modulation of hormones by the uterus, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, when we get there, I'll make sure to point that out. Okay. Fundamentally, the changes we see in the female reproductive system over the menstrual cycle are caused by changes in estrogen and progesterone concentrations, which are coming from the developing follicles and a structure that forms after an egg cell is released. This structure, yeah, we'll look at it, the Corpus Luteum. We are going to see a lot of other hormones coming into play as we look at these changes, though. We're going to be thinking about follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. We're going to talk about luteinizing hormone, LH. We'll also see gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, I think is the abbreviation. And if we actually end up with a fertilized egg in a pregnancy, we'll look at HCG. Okay. But the estrogen and progesterone are highlighted here because these are the ones that are really coming from the ovary. Those other hormones are coming from other places in the body. So they play a role in the cycle, but they're not the ones that are produced by the ovary. So let's dive into the ovarian cycle. Okay, so the first big thing we want to know about the ovarian cycle is, well, actually, the very first thing I want you to know is that day 1 of the ovarian cycle is the first day of menstruation. So your period is the beginning of the cycle. That's why women in the class who have been to the doctor, they'll ask for the first day of your last period. That's because that's considered the beginning of the entire cycle. Okay. So the whole cycle can be split in half. So it's running from the first day of your period, so the first day of menstruation, until the last day right before. Or we're going to split it in half. And that's because roughly halfway through, we have ovulation, where our oocyte is released from the ovary. So before we get there, we call it the follicular phase. And the follicular phase is going to be characterized by development of our primordial follicles, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, developing this oocyte, developing new structures. When our oocyte is released, the follicle then collapses, creating the corpus luteum. And so this is second half of the menstrual cycle is called the luteal phase, because we don't have the follicles developing anymore. We have this corpus luteum degenerating. That's actually kind of interesting because the corpus luteum is going to be releasing hormones. So in these pictures, it kind of just looks like a fat blob, but it's actually really important. Okay. So each of these phases lasts approximately 14 days, but there's plenty of variation there. It's easiest to think of this as an approximately 28-day cycle, about 2 weeks in each phase. Okay. So starting with the follicular phase, what we're interested in for the follicular phase is growth and development of the follicle, right? So we're starting out with these primordial follicles. And the beginning of this phase is actually kind of random. And I don't mean that in a colloquial way. I mean that the follicles start out, each of them is developing a little bit, and they're developing at their own rates, which, as far as we know, it's not particularly regulated. It's not like your body is selecting one specific follicle to grow. They're all kind of on their own paths. So they're all developing a little bit. And then at a certain point, it becomes clear that one follicle is farther along, is more developed than the others. That is then going to become our dominant follicle, and that is going to be the follicle that really controls this whole cycle. That's going to be the follicle that ultimately releases an oocyte. Okay. So as our follicles are developing, so a few follicles are developing from primordial follicles, increasing in size, and they're producing some new structures. So we have a membrane kind of forming between the oocyte and the epithelial cells. So we have something called the zona pellucida forming. We eventually have something called the antrum form, kind of within that area. The antrum is like a fluid-filled kind of sac between the oocyte and the outer layer of cells. Okay. And the antrum continues to grow throughout the development. Okay, so we have the continued kind of growth of this fluid-filled compartment until we end up with a larger follicle that we're going to call a Graafian follicle. So we're going to call our mature follicle a Graafian follicle. And in the Graafian follicle, the antrum, this fluid-filled compartment, gets so big that ultimately it's going to burst. So when it bursts, that releases the oocyte. So this oocyte is going to get released out of the ovary into the fallopian tubes, and it's going to leave behind these other structures. So these other structures are what are going to degenerate and become the Corpus Luteum. Try and turn off my camera. So the trigger for this, for this kind of switch from the follicular phase to the luteal phase, which is marked by ovulation, so the bursting of the antrum, is the fact that we have this surge of a hormone called luteinizing hormone, LH. It's called luteinizing hormone because that's where the corpus luteum forms, right? After ovulation, that's when we form this structure. So when we take a look at our graphs of hormone levels, we'll see that there's a huge spike in LH that triggers ovulation. Now, that spike in LH has its own kind of root cause, which is a surge in GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone, which was one of the hormones we saw coming from the anterior pituitary. Okay. So the brain is involved, but there's going to be a complex interplay here because the GnRH surge is also itself going to be a response to rising estrogen levels. So I actually find for this specific section of our unit, the maps of the hormones are really, really helpful because there's really a cascade of events happening here. Okay. But LH surge is happening like right here, right before ovulation. So if we were tracking LH, this is where we would see a real spike. Okay. So after the follicle ruptures, so the antrum, that fluid-filled compartment, is breaking, the rest of the structure is forming this gland called the corpus luteum. So all of this stuff is becoming a gland. Here we see our corpus luteum. Okay. So this is really important because the corpus luteum secretes estrogens and progesterone. So when we take a look at that, we're going to see that estrogens and especially progesterone are going to rise in this phase when the corpus luteum is there to produce them. The corpus luteum keeps producing estrogen and progesterone, but its sort of maximum length of activity is about 10 days, and then it starts to degenerate. It gets kind of reabsorbed by your body. And that's in the case that the oocyte that was released is not fertilized. Okay, so it sticks around for like 10 days, but then it starts to degenerate through this process called luteolysis. Right? Lysis always kind of means we're breaking something down. So luteolysis is we're breaking down the corpus luteum. When luteolysis occurs, this means that, right, we had a spike in our estrogen and progesterone levels, went on for like 10 days. We're then going to start to see them decrease at the end of this cycle. So we're going to see a decrease in estrogens and progesterone at the end of the luteal phase, which is going to be the trigger for menstruation. So when they drop low enough, that's ultimately what's going to trigger the uterus to kind of shed its lining. Now, this does happen differently in the case that the oocyte is fertilized. So in the case that the oocyte is fertilized, the corpus luteum doesn't degenerate, it sticks around and keeps producing hormones. So this only happens if the oocyte is not fertilized. Okay. So here's just a picture kind of mapping out exactly what we're talking about with all these terms, just because it's kind of helpful to see them. Right, so our primordial follicle had this outer layer of follicle cells. This was our oocyte inside. Our oocyte stays inside, but that outer layer is developing further as we get to this bigger structure, the primary follicle. So we have granulosa cells now. We even produce an outer layer called theca cells, which are kind of involved in receiving some of these hormonal signals. We have this membrane kind of layer between the granulosa cells and the oocyte called the zona pellucida. Then we call it a secondary follicle when we start to see the antrum, which is our fluid-filled sac. Graphian follicle we would recognize because the antrum's really big. So it's started to, it's basically ready for ovulation, right? We still have the oocyte here. We have a little bit of kind of those granulosa cells that are still around the oocyte, kind of within the antrum. So we call those the corona radiata. They have their own term, right? But then the antrum bursts, the corona radiata, so a couple of those like granulosa cells from before, and the oocyte are released into the female reproductive tract. Everything else is staying, becoming the corpus luteum. Eventually it degenerates, and so when it's down to a tiny speck, we change its name again to the corpus albicans. I'm more interested in you understanding kind of the concept than these terms, but I think if you're going to make flashcards, it's worth your while to kind of put some of these terms on flashcards, because they're all kind of just a mess of words that you just have to remember. It's and one of those things in biology. Sometimes it really does just mean learning vocabulary words and memorizing them. And that's the case with basically these names. Okay. So now we want to map on the uterine cycle to the ovarian cycle, because while we have the ovaries developing these follicles and ultimately releasing them when the LH surge happens, so creating ovulation, at the same time the uterus is preparing basically to help sperm move through the female reproductive tract and then to receive a fertilized egg should fertilization actually happen. Okay. So this is happening at the same time, and it maps on pretty well. So we have 3 phases instead of 2 when we're talking about the uterine cycle. We have menstrual phase when you're actually shedding the uterine lining. So this is when we would see bleeding. We have the proliferative phase where the uterus is kind of regrowing things. Then we have the secretory phase. Okay, the first 2 map onto the follicular phase. So the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase happen before ovulation. And then the secretory phase would happen after ovulation during the luteal phase. All right, so our line for ovulation is here. All right, ovulation. Okay. So if we look at the uterus, it's made of a couple of different layers. And we're zooming in on the inner layer here called the endometrium. So what we see here, this is the endometrium, this structure. It's full of blood vessels and glands. Outside it would be the muscular layer of the uterus. So like if we were to draw on muscle fibers here, this would be the myometrium. So the myometrium is what would like physically contract during birth. So, but what we're interested when we're thinking about the uterine cycle is that endometrial layer. So during the first part of the uterine cycle, remember that the first day of menstruation is the beginning of our ovarian cycle. It's also the first day of our uterine cycle. So what's happening in the menstrual phase is that parts of the endometrium start to kind of shed off. So it's not the whole endometrium, some of it stays, but it's kind of innermost layers. So its layers kind of touching the cavity, the inside of the uterus, start to shed off. That's why we have this red kind of layer drawn on. So that's just the innermost part of the endometrium, which is kind of lining the uterus. So we might refer to it as our uterine lining. So it is part of the endometrium, but we use this term uterine lining just to specify it's the part that's gonna be shed. Okay. So as it pulls away, this does cause bleeding because the endometrium is vascularized. So it has blood vessels in it, right? We can see them here. We can see them here. This is important that it has blood vessels because those blood vessels are going to be important for getting blood flow to a developing fetus, right, eventually, as well as supporting the activity of the uterus itself. Okay, so it's going to cause bleeding when the uterine lining sheds, but to kind of mitigate that, the blood flow to these tissues does decrease. So we can see that these blood vessels are kind of small here during the menstrual phase. Right? We're trying not to bleed too much. They're going to bleed some as the inner part of the endometrium rips away, but your body is trying to help you out here. So this mix of uterine lining and blood from these blood vessels in the endometrium mixes together, causing menstrual flow. So that's your period, is the mix of this uterine lining and blood coming from these blood vessels. Okay. So ultimately the trigger for this, so the trigger that creates menstruation at the very beginning cycle is that there's a decrease in levels of estrogens and progesterone. So just like ovulation was created by a spike of LH, right? So a spike of LH surge equals ovulation. We're going to see that a decrease in estrogen and progesterone, not as dramatic, but a decrease, is going to trigger menstruation and cause this cycle to repeat. We'll see these actual graphs later. The reason the estrogen and progesterone are decreasing is that the corpus luteum is degenerating at the end of the ovarian cycle. So we would have this all kind of looping on itself. So we're going to see this loop, right? It's a circle. It's a loop. So after menstruation, in the uterine cycle, menstruation, if we're mapping this onto the ovarian cycle, we're still during the follicular phase. The uterus is going to be undergoing proliferation, so we'll be in the proliferative phase. So this is our uterine cycle. And just if we were to map the ovarian cycle onto it, right, this part was the follicular phase, and this part is the luteal phase. Okay, so after menstruation ceases, the uterus basically starts to grow back because we're hoping to receive an egg during ovulation. Okay, so the endometrial lining is going to start to develop again. So we're going to recreate this layer that we just shed. We're going to see that glandular tissue in the walls of the endometrium are growing. So we have kind of glands here. Okay. There's a smooth muscle layer that's thickening, and the cervical glands are going to start secreting mucus. So there's going to also be kind of a mucosal layer lying on top as well. This is all being stimulated by estrogens. So the estrogen concentration doesn't completely go to zero at the end of the secretory phase. So we are going to have some estrogens being released by those follicles that are developing in the ovaries. The secretory phase is happening for the last 2 weeks of the cycle. And during the secretory phase, the endometrium is being prepared for implantation of a fertilized ovum. So it's increasing its blood supply. The glands are getting even bigger, and they're going to secrete fluid that's rich in glycogen. So in the case that a fertilized ovum does implant, that glycogen-rich fluid can then feed the growing embryo. The cervical secretions at this point become more sticky, kind of forming a plug. All of this kind of preparing for implantation of a fertilized ovum and pregnancy. So here's the big map of what's going on, comparing at the top there our ovarian cycle, the bottom our uterine cycle. Okay. So the tricky part about this stuff that's really triggering these changes, but also takes some kind of careful attention, is the hormonal changes. Okay. So it's important to realize where these hormones are coming from. So estrogen can come from two places. It can come from the follicles at first, right? The follicles that are developing. So that outer layer basically surrounding our oocytes. And then it can also come from the corpus luteum. Okay, so that's going to come from two places. Progesterone, however, comes only from the corpus luteum. So if we look at estrogen versus progesterone over the course of the menstrual cycle, so just a reminder, so here's our ovarian cycle, this bottom one is the uterine cycle. Okay, so if we look at what's happening with estrogen, we see that first, as the follicle is developing in the ovary, we have an increase in estrogen. It falls in the center, and then it has another increase in response to the corpus luteum. So it's kind of like a camel with two humps for estrogen. But when we look at progesterone, early in the menstrual cycle, so for the first half during the follicular phase, there's like no progesterone. That's because the progesterone comes only from the corpus luteum. So that's one of the big differences between estrogen and progesterone that's important to know. Okay. We're also going to want to pay attention to LH and FSH, which don't come from the ovary themselves, comes from circulating blood flow, but they're important for triggering these events, specifically for triggering ovulation. So here we see our LH surge, right? So we see this spike happening right before ovulation, right? So this spike in LH right before ovulation is what's triggering ovulation itself. We can see that it's kind of linked to a spike in FSH. So they're doing kind of the same thing, but it's really the LH spike, this LH surge that we're most interested in, because that's the part that really triggers the ovulation. Okay. Other thing to note about these graphs, one of the reasons that LH and FSH look so much like a spike, right, rather than an increase that kind of continues or something, is that estrogen and progesterone inhibit LH and FSH. So you can see that we have this spike in LH, right, happening up here. But now that we form the corpus luteum after ovulation, estrogen and progesterone are both increasing, but especially progesterone. So progesterone is inhibiting LH and FSH, and so is estrogen, but as you can see, the bigger difference is in the progesterone. So that's why these go down, is because ovulation is triggering the creation of the corpus luteum, which is then kind of suppressing these hormones. So that's kind of why we have this downhill end of the LH surge. Okay. So these flowcharts, I think, are super helpful so long as you pay attention to which phase we are actually in. So the response of these hormones is going to be different depending on basically whether the concentration of estrogen is kind of lower or higher. But it's easiest to summarize as whether we're early in our phases or whether we're kind of late. So this is how our hormones interact if we're in the early or mid follicular phase. So in the earlier days of the menstrual cycle. Okay. So the first signal in this flowchart is gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that's coming from the hypothalamus. So that we talked about when we were doing the endocrine unit. We're not really going to focus on that for this unit, but hopefully you kind of remember that hormones are secreted from the anterior pituitary. Okay. So we have the hypothalamus, GnRH, going to the anterior pituitary. We have these hormones FSH and LH. Okay. So FSH and LH are the ones we're really interested in. All right. FSH and LH. These are the ones that are going to affect our ovaries and our developing follicles. Okay. So FSH and LH both ultimately affect the granulosa cells. So not the oocyte itself, but that kind of cell layer around them. LH has to make a pit stop through something called the theca cells. An interesting thing about estrogen is that it actually starts out as an androgen and is converted into estrogen. So that's kind of why we have these extra steps here over on the right, is we're creating that estrogen because we're modifying an androgen. Okay. But ultimately, FSH and LH are both acting on the granulosa cells, and the granulosa cells are making inhibin, which inhibits this release, but acts only on FSH. Okay, so it's doing a negative feedback loop, but just on FSH. Estrogen is causing the follicles to develop and go through basically that first half of meiosis. Okay, so we're maturing those oocytes. Because we've increased because we've made estrogen, it's getting into the plasma. Plasma estrogen increases, and the increase in plasma estrogen acts as a negative feedback loop on the secretion of both FSH and LH, as well as gonadotropin releasing hormone, but we're not that focused on that. Okay, so early on in development, LH and FSH are ultimately helping our follicles develop and secrete estrogen, but estrogen also suppresses this system. Okay. We're not worried about these. Okay. I want to take us now into the late follicular phase. So early on, right? So in the early and mid follicular phases, we have plasma estrogen acting as a negative feedback loop, right? So we're keeping LH kind of low here early, but remember we have that spike for ovulation of LH and to a lesser extent FSH. That is caused by a change that we see in the late follicular phase. So as we reach the late follicular phase, estrogen levels overall in the plasma are now just higher because they've been released by these follicle cells, right? The follicle cells have been releasing them for a while. This changes fundamentally how estrogen affects the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So we move from having estrogen secretion inhibit LH and FSH to a positive feedback loop where estrogen secretion increases LH and FSH. Way back in ANP1, we talked about the difference between positive and negative feedback loop, right? And we saw that a negative feedback loop is where you have something go up and it gets pulled back down, right? Maintaining kind of homeostasis, remaining bringing us down to constant levels. But we talked about how a positive feedback loop, right, is where you have something increase a bit and then it kind of snowballs. So we have kind of runaway growth. And we saw that happening in clotting, but we don't talk about positive feedback that much. But here is a place that positive feedback is really important because that's what's causing this spike in LH and FSH. That's what's causing this LH surge. So we are going to finish this up on Monday because the rest of this is important and this is kind of a complex topic. But I don't expect for it to take the whole time, and I'll make sure that you have any review materials available to you to kind of help you study as we move forward. Okay, have a great weekend, everybody. I hope that